Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to the NRW. I'm your host, Rob Medina, and I thank you all very much for joining me here today because today I'm going to be reviewing the movie Showdown. So this week on September 17th marks the 30-year anniversary of this film's release because this movie came out back in September 17th, 1993. And I actually saw this movie for the first time at home around the same time I saw Only the Strong, which I had done a review for that film here in the channel, which I recommend you guys do check out because I did go in depth about how I came across the movie, which is very similar to how I came across this film as well, too. The only major difference, though, is that with Only the Strong, I believe I came across that movie on TV, like a cable network, like TBS or something like that. And this movie, on the other hand, I came across it through, I believe, might have been Cinemax, Showtime, one of those type of channels. And I do remember at the time when I first saw this movie, I remember distinctly sitting to watch the film when I first saw it was because of Billy Blanks, who was one of the stars in this movie, because I had seen a film that he had done prior to this movie called Blood Fist, which he was the villain in that film, where he went up against Don the Dragon Wilson, which at the time I loved the film. I hadn't seen the movie in such a long time, so I don't know whether or not if the film will still hold up for me, but I do remember distinctly thinking, like Only the Strong, that this movie, I loved it when I saw it. And back in the day, I used to we used to have like TV Guide on there's a TV Guide channel that would show you all the films and TV shows that were going to be airing at a certain time, because back in those days you had to literally wait to see what was going to be coming up, and you had a channel or a magazine that would tell you when those respective films would be coming on and which channel they'd be coming on as well too. So I'd always look out for that to see when this film will be airing again so I could watch it again, because I loved it the first time I saw it. And somewhere around that time, when I stopped watching Only the Strong is when I stopped watching that film. But I distinctly remember thinking I wanted to see this film again, more so than Only the Strong. And for whatever reason, I kind of forgot about Only the Strong, but this film always stuck with me. And then, even though in this day and age, you have the opportunity to go and look for an actor's name and you can just see the filmography and find the films that they've worked on, I never did that with Billy Blanks. I just kind of forgot about it to do so. So how I came across this movie again, because I hadn't seen this movie in easily well over 20 years, but I came across this film on Tubi, of all places. So thank the movie gods for that, because when I saw Billy Blanks, I remember just looking at the poster for this film and I thought, this movie looks somewhat familiar. Let me check it out and watch it. When I saw it right away, I was like, holy shit, this is the movie that I wanted to see that I hadn't seen in such a long time, since the 90s. And I fell in love with this movie again. I will be the first to admit, though, that this movie is not very, very good. And when I say that, I hope it doesn't come out as being disrespectful, because I'm certainly not dismissing all the hard work that went into making this movie, because there's a lot of great qualities that I do love about this film. But there are a lot of issues with this movie as well, too. But I'll be the first to admit, though, that the issues in this film is part of the charm that worked very well for me, because the movie does have, believe it or not, a lot of heart due to the main star in the film, and Ken Scott, who is most famous for his role in playing Raphael in the original 1990 Ninja Turtles movie, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles film, I meant to say, and also in the second one, because in the first film, he was actually one of the foot soldiers, and then there's a whole story how he went from being a foot soldier to Raphael, and then he ended up being Raphael for all the action sequences, whereas in the sequel of that film, he was just the actor in the suit, not the action actor doing all the stunts. So that is what he's mostly known for, but he had an opportunity to star in a full-on action film, and I still love this movie. And again, as I said before, it's not a perfect film by any means. There's a lot of issues with this movie, but I still think this movie has a lot of enjoyment factors that reminded me of the time when I saw this movie the first time as a kid, that it still carries on with me to this day, believe it or not. And I think this is like one of those very rare instances where you can see the movie hasn't aged very well in certain respects, but at the same time, it still holds up for me in terms of like connecting with the characters, understanding the motivations. And even though there are a lot of cheesy elements to this movie, it still works well for me, that to the point where I felt like it was necessary to finally do a review for this film, because I purposely waited to do a review for this film around the anniversary time. So I'm hoping that this will get some traction and people will go out of the way to check out the film, which is for free on Tubi. I highly recommend you guys do check out here. So I will be getting into the plot synopsis here, and of course I'll be getting into my positives, my negatives, and then my rating. Ken has just moved from Kansas with his mother. He talks to a girl named Julie, not knowing that her boyfriend Tom is very possessive of her. Tom is learning karate from Lee, a sensei whose brother was killed by a rookie cop named Billy. Billy has since become the janitor of the school that Ken, Julie, and Tom go to. When Ken gets beaten up by Tom for talking to Julie again, Billy helps Ken by teaching him how to defend himself, which eventually leads to a battle between student versus student and sensei versus sensei. And that right there is the film in a nutshell. So now let's get into my positives. My first positive for me, believe it or not, actually has to do with the fact that when I saw the movie again for the first time a few years ago, again, I saw this movie around the same time that I saw Only Strong again after, well over 20 years of not seeing these two films. And it happened to be around the same time that when I saw Only Strong and Showdown for the first time, it was around that same time frame. And then not having seen it in over 2 decades, and then seeing these two films again around the same time that I happened to come across them, I just thought it was really interesting that how that all had worked out. And then they also happen to be having a 30th anniversary around the same time of the releases, because again, Only the Strong came out, I believe, in August 28th of 1993, and this one came out September 17th, 1993. So the fact that they're within the same release time frame, I thought it worked out quite well, that I got to be able to talk two films I hadn't seen in over 2 decades and be able to talk about this. And then I remember telling myself too that I want to review both of these films, but when is the anniversary? And then having seen that they were within the same time frame in 2023 for that 30th anniversary, I purposely wanted to hold off on that. So I was spending a lot of time going back to these films, watching them over and over and over again. And it always brought me back to the time of when I first saw the film, or especially after the fact, within that time, like how much joy I got out of these movies. And again, I am the first to admit as far as Showdown is concerned, it's not the greatest movie in the world. It really isn't that great of a film. And I'm not trying to be insulted when I say that, so I hope it doesn't come up being disrespectful, but it really isn't a good movie. But for some reason, this movie really worked for me, because all the characters that we come across in this film, and I've read some reviews about the film after I'd seen it in quite some time, that the story was very repetitive. We've seen the story before. It's exactly the same film that we get with Karate Kid, which Karate Kid came out in 84. This movie came out almost 10 years later, 93. So I remember the time when I talked about this movie, I think I hyped up this film back in the day when I was telling people, like, you got to watch Showdown. It's an awesome movie. And then someone had saw it, and they came back to me like about a week or so later, if I recall correctly. And they're telling me this is exactly like Karate Kid. It's the exact same film. I was like, no, it's not, because I hadn't seen Karate Kid in quite some time. So I came across Karate Kid by chance, and I saw that movie, and I thought, wow, it's exactly the same plot. And for some reason, at that time, I still liked Showdown better. I always thought the Showdown, for me, was the better film. Now, and looking back at that now, I was just so hyped on that movie. But clearly, the Karate Kid is the better film of these two here, I should say. But for some reason, I still have the same sentiments towards this movie that I hold a lot stronger than I do, believe it or not, with the Karate Kid. I don't know why. I really don't know what it is about this movie that I would go watch this over the Karate Kid. And again, not to say that Karate Kid isn't a good, it's a great film. It's a much better movie. But for some reason, this is the film that I would choose any time of the day, every day of the week, over the Karate Kid. I don't know why. I'm more invested with this movie than I am with the Karate Kid. And that's exactly how I felt about it at that time too. So for me, this movie did bring out a lot of enjoyment factor for me that I truly did gravitate to. And it's funny too, because I remember even as a kid, I thought that, I'd seen a lot of, really well-made movies that like really spoke volumes to me. Like I remember I saw A Perfect World with that was with Clint Eastwood and Kevin Costner. Like I remember watching that movie, and a lot of change for me as far as my view on the film on films in general that it got from that movie, along with True Romance and various other movies along the way. But for some reason, there's always a few films that aren't considered to be very, very good, and for some reason they always speak to me, and I always hold so close to me. And despite the fact I hadn't seen this movie in over 20 years, I got that same feeling from this movie. And for me, if a movie can do that for me, despite how good or bad it is, that's enough for me. And when I go back and watch this film, I truly still have the same sentiment every single time I watch the movie. And there are some pretty bad scenes in this movie when it comes to in terms of acting and in terms of certain plot holes that are kind of just glaring in this movie, which are plenty in this movie. But for some reason, I still connect with the overall story. And a lot of it has to do with the characters for me personally, because the main star of the film is Ken Scott, and he was somebody that has been a part of a franchise that I have grown to love and be invested with even to this day. And for a movie that he's in now, that he was in now at that time, that I still have the same type of attachment to when it comes to my childhood and what it brought to my childhood and the great memories that I've gotten from that period during my childhood. You know, this guy was a part of two films that were certainly impactful for me when it comes to the connections that I got from those movies. So, and the reason for that is because when you watch Ken Scott as performance in this movie, I'm the first to admit it's not the greatest performance at all, but there's something really interesting about his performance in that film that I've gathered learning it after the fact was when I had saw this movie a few years ago for the first time, again in over 20 years, I'd seen some interviews that he had done, and the same person that I saw in that interview reminded me of the character that he played in this movie, in Ken Marks. So to me, he was basically, it looked like he was just playing himself, but having to act out certain emotional scenes in the movie, which I felt like he struggled with in the movie. But basically, at the end of the day, he was just playing himself. And so I basically felt like I got an authentic performance when it comes to the man just playing somebody that we could relate to and really bringing a certain dignity about the character, a certain respect value that he carries about himself, where he's all about treating everyone respectfully, saying hi to everybody, and not having to be concerned about, you know, who's cool, who's not cool. He's just he's willing to talk to anybody and be friends with everybody. And that's exactly how the same type of characteristics that I've noticed when I watched him during various interviews he's done throughout the years. It's basically the same guy that I'm seeing in this movie too, as I've already mentioned before. So I did appreciate that form of authenticity that we got from the character, because to me, it felt like Ken was basically playing himself for the most part. And then when it also came to the character of his best friend, the character's name is Mike, played by John Asher. That's another character I'm going to say that for me also helped amplify the story, where you have the new guy who no one for some reason didn't want to give a chance and talk to, and then the one person that comes out and says, hey, you know, let me tell you some things to kind of help him understand how the whole how the school works when it comes to the hierarchies and the various type of people that are out around there, who you should avoid, who you can talk to, and so on and so forth. Like, he's the one guy that's pretty much giving it out to him, like, be very careful, and I'm going to help you through that as well. And eventually they form a friendship, they form a bond that, you know, I'll be the first to admit too, when it comes to that, it's not necessarily the best handled when it comes to that aspect of the story, but on surface level, it's established pretty early on, and it is something that's earned along the way as well too. When you get to see that, when Ken gets beat up by the bullies in the school, his friend comes out to look out for him and tries to talk to him about these various things that he should be doing, the stories that he's hearing, and, you know, hey, if you do these things, you know, Tom, the bully's going to beat you up, and so on and so forth. So there's certainly a friendship that you get to see it gets developed pretty early on. Not the best way of doing it, to be honest with you, in terms of like storytelling, but it pretty much sets the tone of what you can expect between these two, and knowing that they're going to be friends at the end of as the film progresses along the way, and it's exactly what happens. But I think that friendship, in my opinion, it's cheesy, but it worked for me. Now, when it comes to the love interest played by Christine Taylor, who I completely forgot she was in this movie, because I don't remember if I was aware of her prior to this film, but I remember seeing this movie, and then I had seen the Brady Bunch film, and I remember her from Showdown, when I saw the Brady Bunch movie where she played Marsha in the movie, and she was also in The Craft as well, and she's been in several other movies, especially with her husband Ben Stiller, Dodgeball, Zoolander, quite a few other films as well. And so she's someone who's been in the industry for a number of years at this point. So when I saw her in that movie, it was interesting for me to look back at now and see how, you know, her acting is concerned. Because that was one of the first things, I'll be honest with you, I was looking at to see how was she a good actor in this movie. And she was actually quite good. In fact, I'll be frank with you, I think she was the best actor in this whole movie when it came to the performance and the delivery through the various emotional wavelengths that she has to go through, where she was really, really happy, clearly very infatuated, someone who's very scared, very concerned, very angry. And I think she conveyed all those emotional beats quite really up to standard, in my opinion. better than everybody in this movie. So when it comes to her acting, this as far as I'm concerned, she definitely does carry. You can see that she's, the actor that she is now is not the same one that she was in this movie, but you can tell that she was the best one out of everybody in the group, and you can tell she's gotten better throughout the years. When you watch her movies up from that point on, moving forward from there. So, but when it comes to the relationship that you get to see that her and Ken are developing for the story, it's kind of a weird one, because it's one of those things where it's like it's kind of like it seems like I'm going to say it's going to sound like a forced situation. It really isn't, but once it starts to get established there, you can see that Ken is obviously very infatuated with her, very finds her very attractive, because she is very attractive. But when the story progresses, you get to see that he's really not the type of guy that's wanting to disrupt anything to cause problems for anybody. But then you could see that their motivations, that when you find out that the boyfriend is a jerk and very possessive of her as well, which you can clearly see, he starts to realize that maybe I can help her out of this here as well too, even though he doesn't blatantly say that out loud. But you can tell that there's a motivation for him to want to continue on and talking to her, because he knows that the guy that she's with is no good for her and she deserves better. Not to say that he's the better guy, but certainly feeling that, I can probably offer her something that this man can't offer her, that will give her stability, give her appreciation, to show her that she's cared for, that she's respected. And that is something you really do believe that he can really give to her, that the boyfriend and Tom that she's dating is not giving it to her at all. So in that sense, I feel like that was a very wonderful aspect of the relationship, where you get to see where his character is really looking out for the best interest for not just for himself, but really for her as well too, and offering something that her current boyfriend and Tom is not really giving to her. So I always thought that relationship in that aspect really worked well for me personally. Now, when it comes to the villains in this movie, I'm going to say this here: they're not the greatest villains at all. They're the motivations for the villains are really quite ridiculous in my opinion. But I will say that what I do appreciate about this movie is that you know exactly who the good guys and who the bad guys are. And the good guys, they have good intentions. They're not wanting to disrupt, anybody's lives. They're just wanting to make friends. The bad guys, in their hand, they have a certain hierarchy and they want to maintain that hierarchy. And for someone who's walking in not knowing anything about this whole situation, they seem to be pretty ignorant about the other person's unawareness of how things are, to more or less properly educate them, if you will. Instead, they're just pretty brutal about the whole thing. Well, like, hey, don't talk to my girlfriend, or don't do this. And they're vicious about their approach when it comes to making the people understand that I'm in charge and you should do what I say. So I actually like that aspect of the characters. Again, when it comes to how it's handled in the film, it's not the greatest by any means. There's really no depth to behind that, but the motivations for the characters as far as why they are that way, I always felt like was pretty established early on, where you get to see where they're coming from, despite the fact that it's not maybe handled, it doesn't have a lot of depth behind the character's motivation, if you will. But I always felt like that was pretty established early on. And the reason why I felt like it worked for me, despite the fact that it wasn't handled the greatest, is because both Patrick Kilpatrick, who plays the Sensei Lee, the bad guy, and Tom, who is the main bully in this movie, I always felt like that their dedication, in my opinion, what it looks like to me is their dedication is that they are pretty set on showing who's the boss. And they look like to be having a lot of fun with it as well too, because there are some wonderful aspects about, in this case, the character of Tom, where for some reason it seems like he just doesn't care for other people's well-being so long he gets what's his. And despite the fact that he has a girlfriend, he's also having what looks like to be more or less like an affair with one of the employees that works with Lee at the dojo that he trains at and that she works at. And yet he's having a little thing with her that kind of leads nowhere. But the point I'm getting at is that this is a guy who clearly likes to do what he wants, when he wants, how he wants, and doesn't care who it affects in the long term. So I did appreciate that aspect of both of those characters, played by Patrick Kilpatrick and the other actor Ken McLeod. So I like I said before, it's not they're not the greatest characters at all, and I'll be the first to admit that the acting's not the greatest either. But I love what they have established early on, and knowing what their motivations are, and there's no secret behind all that at all whatsoever. And I also appreciate too, I will say in this as part of the positive, is that when Ken gets the upper hand on Tom in their final battle, there's a respect factor that comes with that as well too, where you get to see that he slowly started to change his perception on Ken, and at the same time really learning to just let go of, I guess, that more or less ruthless approach that he had before, and just letting things just be as they are, and respect other people along the way. And him getting his ass whooped certainly had taught him that lesson. So I actually felt like that worked quite well for the movie towards the end of the film, even though it was kind of cheesy, but I still thought it worked for me personally. Now, I will say one thing to kind of more or less close off with the positive here. Two things actually I'm going to say. Billy Blanks is I never thought he was a good actor. Even at that time as a kid, I never really thought he was that good of an actor. I remember when I first saw the movie that I never really connected with his character, but I liked his character enough because I liked what the character's intentions were, and he had really good intentions at that. But for some reason, even as a kid, I just never really connect with him as an actor. But I loved what he was doing when it came to training Scott and making him a fighter, making him fit, making him strong. And I always thought I'll never forget, there's a scene in the movie that as a kid, I replicated the same training technique as a kid, where he was training Ken, and they were on this hill out in where they were living, where the story is taking place at, and he grabbed the backpack and put a bunch of rocks in it, and then had Ken put the backpack on and run uphill. I remember distinctly thinking I want to do the exact same thing too, because I felt like if Ken is doing that, I should do that as well too. So believe it or not, as a kid, that movie helped me get motivated to train and become stronger as well. At that time, I might have been like, I don't know, maybe 9, 10, possibly 11, somewhere around that time frame. And I remember I got my backpack and I just stuffed a bunch of textbooks at that time that I had, and I would go to the park, and then there was a hill at the park, and I would purposely run up the hill, up and down, realizing how hard it really was. So, but I remember thinking, like, if Billy told him to do it, it's for a good reason. So I remember how that movie had that impact on me to want to work out more, and seeing the training techniques that he had presented and taught to Ken really stuck with me. Even to this day, I'll be frank with you, believe it or not, to this day, it's one of those things I still carry it with me, where I remember seeing that and thinking that's what I need to do, and put a little bit more weight on, and learn to use the weight to help develop the strength and the speed and the muscle and so on and so forth that I wanted to start building for myself. So it's one of those things that still stuck with me to this day, that I've learned from what Billy Blanks had used to train his student in Ken. So I always appreciated the approach that Billy's character and the character Billy, that he was using to help Ken through this whole process, that, believe it or not, to this day still stuck with me. So when it came to the action in this movie, I will say that they are not the greatest at all. It's actually kind of bad, to be honest with you, but it still worked for me though, because the one thing I did appreciate about this film is that you do have a lot of wide shots. It's none of this crap that we have today lately, where there's a trend of like these quick edits and up close shots, and where you have a punch kind of start from here and then all of a sudden end right there before you can even see it land. So it's always one of those annoying factors that I still have a problem to this day with a lot of action that still do that. But back in those days, it was never really a thing where you had to concern yourself with it, because you actually had the time to see how the fight started to develop. And then, even though it wasn't handled the greatest, but you always had the shots where you can see where the punch started and where it ended. And that I did like about with this movie. And again, it's not the greatest, but I still enjoyed it. And I still was rooting for the good guys and happy to see the bad guys get their ass whooped along the way. So I always did appreciate that. Now, one thing I will also add to, as before I really sign off with the positives here, is that, this was definitely a low budget film, but back in those days, in the 90s, especially in the 80s and 90s, where low budget films at that time isn't like what low budget films are these days, where you actually had a pretty wide set of cast and crew that are working on a project, certainly on a minuscule scale in comparison to a lot of major Hollywood films, especially at that time. But they seem to have the same exact approach as a major studio when it came to getting wide angle shots and getting crane shots and getting some wonderful lighting with the cinematography. And even though the acting wasn't always the greatest, but you still had the proper angles to see where the characters are coming from when it comes to their emotions, when it comes to the various wavelengths of emotion they have to go through. And you also get to see a lot of scope with where the locations are at. You have the school backdrop, you have certain aspects of the neighborhood, even though it's mostly shot in the same locations over and over again, but you always had a understanding of like there's a lot of space in this area that they were able to explore and use. And even though they were using it on more than one occasion, but just allowing for the characters to do something and giving wide shots for them to just hear them talk and hear them go through the motions, or see them go through the motion, if you want me to say, and really being able to let that sink in that capacity. So I always felt like that movie did a really good job in just doing that. And that is something that nowadays, where I feel like in certain movies, not all of them, certain films don't necessarily accomplish that the same way when it comes to having to work on a smaller budget film and give it scope. It's always like tight shots and a lot of bad camera handling and whatnot. And there are some great directors and writers out there, or actors say too, that are able to understand when it comes to the limitations they would have, but they still want to give it a lot of scale, a lot of scope, and give room for the actors to do their thing, give room for the action to really, to really just show the audience of like, wow, the hard work that went into that, so that way it can sell the punch and receive the punch and so on and so forth. And that is something that it's very hard to do, especially when you're running on a really tight schedule with very limited resources and very little money. And yet this movie, in my opinion, despite the fact it's not the greatest when it comes to certain aspects of those type of things I was pointing at before, but it did offer those scopes in some way or shape or form to really let you have the environment sink in, for you to be invested, at least in my opinion, because that's how it certainly was like for me. So I always did appreciate about that movie, despite the fact that it's a low budgeted film, but I never felt like it was a low budget film, if that makes any sense. So for me, that's gonna be the end of my positives. Now let's get into my negatives. Now, when it comes to the negatives with this movie, there's actually quite a few. But again, the negatives I'm putting out here, it does not take away my enjoyment of the film at all. In fact, it actually enhanced it for me personally. Even upon repeat viewing, having seen it a couple of years ago for the first time in over 20 years, I still think that the film works despite the major flaws that are in this movie. There's no doubt about that. I know this is not a film that I could watch with somebody and say, this is a great movie, because I still think it's a great film. But I know that I can't recommend this movie to somebody and say, this is a great film, and they're going to get the same enjoyment, if any enjoyment at all, that I do. But the flaws that are in this movie are quite prevalent in this movie. When it comes to, in the beginning of the film, Billy Blanks' character, he is a cop. And for whatever reason, he hates guns, doesn't want to use them, but he's a cop, and he literally puts the gun in his glove compartment that his partner pulls out and says, you got to keep this on you because you never know when you're going to need it. That is one of the most dumbest things that I don't buy it at all. I really don't buy that notion of him wanting to become a cop and doesn't want to use a gun. It just does not make sense for me at all. And then I can understand that if he had to use a gun in the beginning of the film, where because Billy Blank's character and Kilpatrick's character, they have a run-in with each other. That this story takes place 7 years prior to the events of this movie that you get to see in the very beginning of this film. That I could see that if his brother was, if Patrick's character Lee, him and his brother were at a party and they're causing problems or pretty much just ruining the party, and in that particular situation, if Billy's character comes in and has to pull a gun on them and tell them stop bothering people or we're gonna have to arrest you, and they start an altercation and he ends up shooting his brother, I can see that, that's why I don't want to use guns, and I quit, because he ends up quitting the force, and then we find out he becomes a janitor. But I just don't understand that aspect of the character, because it was presented and it was never used at all after that. So it was like a really pointless aspect of the story or attribute of the character that we just never got to see, as far as why he felt that way in the first place, and then have any effect in the overall narrative. The other thing that was also a major plot hole has to do with the sudden shift of character change when it comes to the character of Lee, because in the beginning of this movie, he has no mustache. He was a wild guy. He was just like grabbing people and taking people's drinks, shoving people around, bullying them. He was like a very wild card. And then all of a sudden, after the death of his brother, who actually cracks his neck when Billy shoves him off in the altercation they had at that party. All of a sudden, he's very, like do as I say and not as I do, and just obey me. I'm your master, and this and that. Like it was just like a night and day shift that occurred almost out of the blue, because you just don't see him for you see the 7 years that passed from the events that occurred in the very beginning of the film, and then he has a scar, he has a mustache, he has 2 scars, if I recall, and there was no backstory about what had occurred along the way for his character to change from being this college bully, if you will, to this this very cold, hardened, goofy villain that just seemed like a left turn that just didn't make any sense to me. When I saw the movie for the first time, I didn't care. I thought it worked. Seeing it now, it doesn't work as well for me, which is why I always feel like the villain wasn't very memorable. It was the heroes that were memorable, not the villain so much. I always thought the villain was funny more than anything else. Never threatening. I mean, even though he was threatening, you definitely did feel that threat for sure. But it just didn't work for me that way, and that's one thing that just didn't age very well for me personally. And then the other thing I will point out too is that even though Lee, being the villain, is supposed to be like this incredible fighter, he is the worst fighter in the entire movie. His fighting technique was awful, and at the time as a kid, I thought this was amazing. But now I'm looking at it, I'm such a stickler when it comes to action sequences that I do like my good action scenes. I do like and appreciate really good action sequences. Even if an actor is not the greatest martial artist, find out what the strengths are and let that be the train them in that facility in that area as quickly as you can, as best as you can, to make sure they can showcase the strength that they're able to pull off here to the best of their abilities for the screen. This movie does not have any of that at all when it comes to this character of Lee, where he's just boom, grabs a guy, headbutts him, and then he just kicks him in the stomach and then throws him away, and that's it. There's nothing that I saw that this character offered for me to really truly take him seriously as a villain. And that's the biggest downfall for me personally, because even though on paper the villain is definitely threatening, there's no doubt about that, because everyone is fearing him and they're scared of him, but it was mostly a joke to me personally. And that's not to be disrespectful towards Patrick Kilpatrick's performance, because I thought it was funny, I thought it worked, but maybe not the way that it intended on working as far as how it worked for me. So that was one of the biggest issues that I have with the film now. But again, despite the issues that I have with the character, I still liked him. I still thought he was funny, and I really thought he was the shtick that he had was, I don't think it was meant to be funny by any way or shape or form, but it always stuck out to me as being one of the funniest things of this whole movie. But clearly, I don't think that was the intention. One other thing I can point out here too, when it comes to the negatives that really does stick out here for me, Billy Blanks is not I hate to say this here too, but he really wasn't very good in the movie when it comes to him being like a really good, I guess like a father figure. And what I mean by that is this: I always felt like the character could have been so much more if we had more time to really get to know the character better, and having the character being used in a manner that when you understood why he's using guns, maybe when he used a gun to accidentally kill somebody, that it really affected him, and you could see the hardships he was going through, and not having talked to his partner in nearly a decade, and then be reacquainted with him again, and actually have a real development for that character, I thought would have worked quite well. Because the when it comes to the teacher's aspect of the films, when it comes to the villain and the hero, those were the weakest parts for me personally. And whereas Patrick Kilpatrick was definitely good for the role as the villain, Billy Blanks, on the other hand, unfortunately for me, didn't work as well. Although I loved what he was doing to help this, and becoming a better fighter, to protect himself, and teaching him discipline, teaching him honor, and all these various other things. But when it came to that was the only good quality that I always felt like that character had. Everything else outside of that, I honestly didn't really connect with him at all. And I always felt like that could have been handled a lot better, because not to say that I felt like Billy Blanks could have done, is probably a much better actor, but if given the time to really to develop those areas for the character, we could have had a much better connection with the overall story with him, because then you would understand where he was coming from, rather than just this exposition that offers nothing. And then with the wide gap that you have for how much time has passed by, and just like that, there's a lot that was missing for me personally. So I always felt like that was one of the weaker parts of the film for me personally. But again, despite those issues, as I said before, it still worked for me. I still love the movie. I still cared for the characters, and I was still rooting for them at the end of the day. So for me, that's gonna be my negatives. Now let's get into my rating. Now, I love this movie. I really do love this film. This reminds me a lot of my love for Street Fighter, the 1994 live action film, because there are a lot of people that hate that movie, and I understand why, and I don't blame them for that. But for whatever reason, I love that film. I connect with that movie, and yet I know the flaws. I understand the issues the film has, and for some reason, I just cannot, just disconnect myself from that. I really do love that film, and that's more or less kind of the same affection that I have with this movie as well when it comes to seeing all the flaws. And believe me, there are glaring flaws from this movie from start to finish. And I always feel like that as long as you can connect with the film and you really get some major enjoyment factor out of it, then at least the film did its job in that sense. And I always felt like this movie, I should say, definitely did accomplish that for me personally. Because even to this day, after not seeing the film in over 20 years, and then seeing it for the first time about 2-3 years ago, I still love this movie. I love this movie so much, and I would be the first one to recommend it to anybody. I don't care if you don't like it after the fact. I still love this film. There are much better movies out there over this film, and I'll be the first to admit that. But despite the issues that are in this movie, I still think this movie does have great qualities, and you can see the hard work that went into making this movie. And I did appreciate that hard work in the film, because you can see it from start to finish, despite the flaws. But I still think this movie does have great qualities when it comes to the characters, when it comes to the motivations, when it comes to what it accomplishes at the end of the day for what they're trying to achieve here. And it definitely does do that for me personally. So for me, I give this movie a solid cheers. And those are my thoughts on the film. Now, if you have seen this movie, let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. And I'll also be sure to have a link for the film that's available for free on Tubi in the description down below, where you guys can check it out. It's with ads, of course. But, if you're an action junkie like myself, I do recommend you guys check out the film. I'm hoping you guys can walk away with some enjoyment factor with this movie. And if you didn't like it, I still would like to hear your thoughts, again, in the comment section down below. And if you love it, I would definitely want to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. And if you haven't done so already, make sure you also subscribe to the NRW, share, like our videos, and hit the notification bell while you're down there as well. And also follow NRW on social media, on Instagram, New Release Wednesdays, on Facebook, Nerds Rule the World, and on Twitter at the NRW. You can follow me on my social media accounts on Instagram, You're So Cool with Rob Medina, on Twitter, You're So Cool with WRM, and on Facebook, simply just Rob Medina. And until next time, everybody, you guys have a wonderful day. Stay safe out there, and cheers.